Cyberpunk 2077. Now there's a game that had a profound effect on the gaming sphere when it came out initially. Unfortunately, none of those effects were particularly positive, with it now being the poster boy of botched launches, especially on the PS4 and Xbox One versions of the game, with the game's initial launch pretty much crippling the reputation of CD Projekt Red. Probably rightfully so due to how the PS4 and Xbox versions of the game were pretty much unplayable due to poor performance and glitches, as well as how even the PC version of the game, while faring better, were still really glitchy and prone to crashes at launch. Add in the marketing revolving around Cyberpunk 2077 and how it promised a bunch of features that didn't make it into the actual game, even to this day, and you can easily see why Cyberpunk 2077 was such a mess at launch. Now I say all this since, well, you can't really talk about Cyberpunk 2077 in earnest without at least mentioning its disastrous launch, but also more importantly due to how the game is much more stable now after 2 years of patches, and how it added various features that should have been in the base game to begin with, such as with the glamour system and multiple apartments. Now, with that said, even though it is a much more stable game now, and has a bunch of features added compared to its launch, I would still say the game is still nowhere the game that it was hyped up to be. Heck, I would say part of the design does still feel half-baked. But I can't deny that the game, in its current state, is good. There are various aspects to it that I think are really well done, parts that got me to keep playing the game for 2 playthroughs. But at the exact same time, the game still has issues that really holds it back, even when you're judging it on its own and not holding it to the promises that the marketing brought forth. So with all that said, I guess I should get into talking about the game's strengths and weaknesses, at least from my perspective. Hello, this is Peter4789 Sirus, and welcome to my foray into Cyberpunk 2077. So firstly, the story and characters. I really enjoyed it. I think Cyberpunk 2077's story and characters are one of the game's strengths. I will say that the overlying main story does touch more heavily into the punk aspect of the Cyberpunk theme, with there being a lot of focus on the dystopian nature of the corporation that rules Night City, well mostly Arasaka, how they corrupt and take everything away from the common man, and about fighting that power or not, and on the overlying themes of being able to truly be yourself as an individual, despite it meaning you be going to an early grave as you try to reach toward the top, or conforming to the forces that be. Yet there are some rather interesting sci-fi concepts about digitized personalities, aka engrams, but I would say that the overlying themes of the story does revolve around the themes that I talked about before, and I say that it works really well. It's an incredibly exciting, loud, and interesting story as you see V try to move up the proverbial ladder of mercenary work, gets evolved into a job that's over his head that results in him getting a piece of technology that is slowly overriding his personality, and then see his journey to try to get rid of said technology, which gets him to work with all type of different factions that works within Night City. Not to mention him having to come to terms with another personality that now exists within his psyche. I think the factor that makes me really enjoy the main story of Cyberpunk 2077 is the dynamic between V and the engram that exists within the biochip that V put in his head, Johnny Silverhand, aka Keanu Reeves. I have to admit that Keanu Reeves does a really good job of getting into the persona of this foul-mouthed, rude, jaded, antisocial, anti-core rocker boy that is Johnny Silverhand. He's just a lot of fun to see on the screen when you see him interact with V, not only in the main story, but in also all the various side gigs they can do as you hear his jaded takes on the various happenings in Night City. He just has this type of magnetism that gets you drawn to his character. And there are also quite a few badass scenes where you play as him, where you really do feel like the badass Night City legend that Johnny Silverhand is supposed to be, which does get you to like him more. Like, he's an asshole, but an entertaining one. I do like how he sort of plays like this devil your shirt angle when you are making some decision making in the game. I also think he gets some interesting development as you learn more about why he hates Arasaka, or Koshi, why he isn't so hot on the current situation on V regarding the biochip rewriting V's personality. I especially think his relationship with V is really nice to see if you are able to befriend him. So all in all, I say I really like Johnny Silverhand. The rest of the characters I think are also really well done. Jackie is probably the most likable character in the game, with him being your partner in crime/best friend at the start of the game, with him and V having a really wholesome and tight relationship with each other, as the two strive to become NC legends of their own. Takamura is essentially what you expect the samurai archetype to be in the futuristic world of Cyberpunk, with his old-fashioned ways and even uptightness having a charm of its own, with him basically being an interesting foil to the rest of the cast, due to how he is pro-Corp and pro-Arasaka. Panam is this impulsive and hot-tempered nomad who's unstrained from her family due to having a difference of opinion from the clan leader Saul, but still fiercely loyal to said clan since it's still her family, with her entire storyline revolving around her wondering what her role to the clan still is, despite being separated from it. Her contemplating if she should try to keep doing her own thing in Night City, even though she is ultimately disillusioned by Night City at this point, or if she should try to go back and mend things with Saul, and go back with her family figure, the Aldecados, and see her try to save the Aldecados in her own way. And so on. I think the characters are pretty good, with each having a pretty interesting story and development in the game. But I guess since I spoke of the main story, I should speak of the side stories. What do I think of them? Well, I think the yellow side gigs are pretty interesting. I mean, they range from being silly one-off events to full-on storylines, so the quality isn't exactly constant, but I have to say that the storylines that do have time to develop are really good. Like, you got one storyline that gets you to investigate what sounds like a normal break-and-enter crime, but then you see it actually ties to what is essentially an Illuminati-like scheme where a politician and his wife are not only monitored in their own home, but also how their very mind and personalities are being reconditioned to fit a mysterious organization's schemes, with you having to decide if it's best to tell the politician the truth or not. Then you get another storyline that gets you to investigate a serial kidnapping case, where you have to find clues to find the remainder of the kidnapped victims, since they were not found with the kidnapper when he was arrested, which gets you to not only find clues on how he was able to lure his victims in, but also gets you to delve into this deranged criminal mind in order to try to find where the kidnapped victims are before it's too late. Then there's this really fun storyline where you basically get Johnny Silverhand's old band back for one last gig, which is really cool. So I would say that the game does have its fair share of really good side stories. Even the one-off ones can be amusing, like the one where you take this guy to the Ripper Dock to fix his junk, or another where you participate in a shooting contest. Albeit there are some that are kind of boring, like I think the diner gig one was pretty boring. But I would say that for the majority of the yellow side gig missions, the stories are really good and interesting, or at least amusing. I will also give props to the blue side gig missions since, although they are pretty light on story and are pretty formulaic, I do appreciate how they do at least try to give each of these blue side gig missions its own unique story flavor, in terms of giving some semi-unique backstory to the main targets of these gigs. But overall, I really like the story and characters of Cyberpunk 2077. Now, is there some disappointing stuff about the story? Yeah. Firstly, I do wish we could have spent more time with Jackie at the start of the game. All in all, I would say that we spend like 10 to 20% of the game with Jackie, which is not that much time if I have to be honest. I do wish we could have spent more time to further solidify the bond that he and V supposedly have. Maybe get us to play the montage part of the intro, but that's just me. I mean, V and Jackie bond works well enough for the story for the most part, but just saying that the bonds could have been much stronger if they allowed us to interact more with Jackie. I mean, there's really only 3 missions that you go with Jackie in the game. The tutorial mission, where you get Sandra Dorset, the mission where you get the flathead from Maelstrom, and then the heist where you steal the biochip for Yorinobu. That's it. So yeah, not that much time, which is a shame. I also say that Yorinobu is strangely not really present for most of the game. I mean, you do feel his influence for the actions of the Arasaka Corporation, which still works for the story, but he himself is pretty much a non-entity. I mean, the only times you see him in the game is during the heist, I guess before the heist when you're doing the brain dance to get information around his office, and then in one of the endings, just one of the endings, which is the devil ending. As a result, Yorinobu as a character can feel pretty underwhelming. I guess the same thing can be said of Adam Savage, but at least you see him at every ending since he's a boss that you fight in the game. But overall, I would say that the individual antagonist in this game is pretty meh. Now, this game's story doesn't really need you to have an individual antagonist to keep you engaged. I think the game does a pretty good job of giving you the urgency you need due to the nature of the biochip overriding your memory and how you need to find a way to get it out before it kills you as V. But I was hoping to have the individual antagonist to at least be interesting or have some more presence in the story, but it isn't the case in this game. Speaking of urgency, I say that the game probably shares a similar problem that Fallout 4 had. And that problem is that it's a story that doesn't really fit with the open world format that the game has due to how the urgency of the main plot would supersede the motivation for the player character to just dick around with the side jobs / side quests. Now, this doesn't bother me too much, but I will say that it can take you out of the story if you start to think about it. Especially in this game where the urgency is incredibly high, due to how the game keeps telling you that you only have like a few weeks to live due to the biochip. Last point I'll elaborate on in terms of the story and characters, in regards to things I found disappointing or lackluster, is probably life paths. Now I should probably talk about what life paths are to begin with. Life paths is essentially your origin story for V, sort of like Origins were for the player character from Dragon Age Origins. Like Dragon Age Origins, your intro mission is entirely tailor-made for the life path you take, which there are 3 of, namely Nomad, Street Kid, and Corporal. Now, I don't think they're good introduction missions for the overall game mechanic-wise, but they do a great job of opening the game narratively, and do like how different the 3 life path missions are, at least the starting missions. The game did a really good job at making each intro life path mission to feel distinct, with the Nomad life path getting you to essentially be an outsider trying to get into Night City, with you doing a smuggler job during that transition, while Corporal gets you to meet with your boss in Arasaka, who orders you to do some corporate sabotage via planning a hit, with you meeting with your contacts to plan it, just to get intercepted and booted out of the Corporal lifestyle. So I have no problems with the life paths at the start of the game. It's just later on, I feel like the choices you get from your life paths are super minimal. Well, maybe it's not the actual choices that I have a problem with. I mean, the choices are pretty minimal, with the life path choices just getting you some extra dialogue and maybe an option to end an encounter faster and usually peacefully. But that's how a decent amount of games do choices nowadays. I think my main big problem with life paths is that I don't feel its consequences or its impact past the starting point of the game. Like once you get past the intro missions, it feels like your life path doesn't really matter outside of the dialogue options, with the overall world not really reacting to what sort of lifestyle you had before. Like V mannerism doesn't change based on his life path, the characters doesn't really acknowledge the life path unless you pick a dialogue option that is based on it, and even then, after that dialogue option, they just treat you like before and forget your life path until you bring it up again. You don't really have a pre-established relationship with the characters or factions in the game based on your life paths outside of Jackie with the corporal lifestyle, and overall it just feels like life paths are so inconsequential, which is incredibly disappointing, especially if you compare it to Dragon Age Origins, where your origins not only shape your entire character in regards to how they play, as well as how it allows you to have unique dialogue options, but also how the world and characters of that game reacted to that origin. You had characters react if you were a human, elf, or dwarf. You had characters react if you were a commoner dwarf or an exiled dwarf noble in Orzammar. You had pre-established relationships with characters based on your origins, like if you were returning to the circle as a mage. Origins worked so well in Dragon Age Origins due to how they felt like they had an impact on both your characters as well as the inhabitants of Ferelden. Sadly, this doesn't feel like the case in Cyberpunk 2077, which is incredibly disappointing. Let's now get talking about the choices in this game, since A, this is a Western RPG and making choices during the course of the game's story is one of the genre's shtick, and B, this is also a hot topic of discussion in the game by people. More notably, the dialogue choices, since the choice you make during the combat sections are usually positively received. But before I talk about that, I just want to quickly give credit to the overall presentation of the conversation system in the game. I think Cyberpunk 2077 has probably one of the best first-person conversation systems in a game that I played in recent memory. The way it seamlessly blends the normal gameplay and convo segments, the way NPCs keep eye contact with you as you talk, even if you move, the way they seamlessly animate these actions within these segments when you choose the appropriate dialogue options. I think it's all executed really well, so kudos to the presentation of the conversation system. But back to the topic at hand. The dialogue choices. Do they actually matter? Do they change up how you can tackle a mission or not? Do you have the ability to change the outcome of a quest? All important questions, since one of the appeals in an RPG like this is to make impactful choices that makes you feel like you are the character and see that you do have impact on the world that the game presents. Well, usually. My answer to these questions is yes and no. I will say that the game does have choices that impact the game. It's just the degree of importance and consequences derived from those choices is where things get a bit murky. Like, the most obvious example of your choices really mattering and changing the direction of the plot is obviously the ending, where you have to choose what type of plan to enact in order to get Mikoshi. I think this part is actually done really well, with each ending feeling incredibly distinct from each other. Like in one of the endings, you basically work with Rogue, where you guys infiltrate Arasaka through crashing into one of the floors of the building via an AV, and then making your way down to Mikoshi by jumping down floor to floor using your gravity boost to negate the fall. Or another ending where you work with a faction within Arasaka to take down Yorinobu. Or another ending where you just go through the front doors, guns blazing, by yourself, and feeling like an absolute legend if you succeed. The final missions are just incredibly well designed and distinct from each other, which really makes it one of the highlights of the game. It's also really cool how one of the endings is based on if you did an optional side quest or not, which again makes it feel like your choices matter in the game. But the ending of the game is not the rest of the game, so how about your dialogue choices before that? I would say that they still matter, but the consequences of those choices are not as impactful. Like, most of the choices will simply either allow you to bypass a certain obstacle if you have the necessary stats and requirements, get more monetary or material gain, or end a quest prematurely. That, and you get to choose the outcome of the quest in regards to the story conclusion. Now, those are nice results to have in response to your choices, but I will say that those choices and their consequences are pretty isolated from each other, with those choices not really mattering outside of their quest, with a few exceptions. I will also say that the dialogue choices don't really change how you tackle a mission too. I mean, it allows you to get past an obstacle and maybe change the outcome, but the quest structure remains the same and pretty linear. I mean, to the game's credit, you at least have the option to approach the main objective uniquely due to how there are multiple ways to get through the objective thanks to the map design and the varied gameplay styles in the game, via hacking, sneaking, and so on. But the main objective is still pretty static in that you still have to reach that same endpoint. Now, I wouldn't have a problem with these qualities. I mean, it's a shame that your dialogue choices don't have more of an overreaching effect, but you can at least feel like your dialogue choices matter in the context of the quest you're doing. So I wouldn't mind this, if it wasn't for the fact that the game kinda baits you with one of the starting quests, where in that quest, you can change how you tackle the quest for your dialogue choices, and how those choices will have a direct effect on the quest after it. Now, people who have played this game will know what I'm talking about, but the quest I'm talking about is, of course, the pickup mission where you get the flathead from Maelstrom. Now, this quest has various paths you can take depending on the choices you make. Like when Royce threatens you to pay for the flathead, you can just shoot and kill him right there and fight your way through the entire Maelstrom base without having to fight Royce himself. Or you can give him the Spike Militech chip, which you get from another quest, where you again will have to fight through Maelstrom, but have to face Royce as a boss this time. Or you could also get rid of the virus on the Militech chip, give it to Royce, give him a heads up about Militech, and then fight with Maelstrom against the Militech troops that invade the factory. This quest is probably one of the few quests in the game where your dialogue choices actually can change the quest structure, and it's one of the rare quests that have lasting consequences later on in the game, which isn't bad. It's a pretty good quest, but it being like one of the starter quests debated me into thinking that the other quests are like this when it isn't, which is pretty disappointing. Now, is this a personal grievance? Possibly, but I did wish there were a few more quests that are multifaceted like this in the game. I think it would be really cool. But as is, I guess Cyberpunk 2077 choice making works okay. Like, nothing too exciting is done with the dialogue choices in this game, outside of the ending. But at the exact same time, nothing horrendous is found in the way they designed the dialogue choices. Well, let's get into the overlying combat systems and the overall RPG progression systems of Cyberpunk 2077. Now, this is the area where I think the game really excels in. Most notably, I think the game does a really good job in offering a great variety of playstyles that are viable and fun to play, as well as having an interesting combat system where you have a lot of options and ways to approach combat. Like, I think the base combat system with the gunplay and melee combat is decent enough in a game like this. Like, it doesn't really do anything new with you being able to do what you expect in a first-person shooter type of game like this, with you being able to run, sprint, slide, jump, aim down your sights, shoot your gun or use your melee weapon you got that equipped, shoot from cover, be able to peek from your cover, sneak/crouch, and so on. The movement and offensive options you got in your base combat system are what you expect, with the exception of the dodge that you have, which is kinda surprising, but still nothing too out there. What makes the combat shine though, and really allow you to have the varied playstyles and options that I talked about before, is the use of your cybernetics that add mechanics to your arsenal, the variety of weapons you got in the game, and of course the RPG progression systems via the skill tree and attributes. It's these three elements that makes the combat have a lot of freedom in it in regards to how you approach battle, which is pretty awesome. But let's now talk about those three elements more in depth. Now, cybernetics is a pretty hot topic to discuss in the game due to the fact how it functions nothing like how it was built up to be in the trailers, even currently. That, and probably more importantly, the fact that a good amount of the cybernetics that you can equip to your character are merely passive stat boosts that doesn't really change up how you play the game. Granted, they do boost the stats that encourage the type of build that you're going for, therefore making it more viable, but those cybernetics still don't really give you any additional options or vastly change the way you approach combat. With that said, there are a handful of cybernetics in the game that I think do a really good job of adding options to your repertoire, and even one cybernetic option that really allows you to have a varied playstyle depending on what you got equipped on that slot. Those cybernetic slots being your arms, legs, and operating system, and to a lesser extent your nervous system and integumentary system cybernetics, since they have cyberware that gives you some neat abilities such as being able to go into bullet time temporarily where everything slows down, or you having camo where you can go invisible for a brief period of time. Though not all the cyberwares are like that in those slots, which is why I say to a lesser extent. But coming back to the arm, legs, and operating system cybernetics, I think the game does a pretty good job of expanding what you can do depending what you got equipped in those slots, with your arm cybernetics allowing you to expand on your offensive capabilities and utilities due to how you can graft on a grenade launcher or various melee weapons onto your arms, which effectively expand your offense, with your fourth weapon slot now being a viable offensive option now, while previously it didn't as much due to how you only had your ordinary fist in that slot. Then you got your leg cybernetics that allow you to either have a charge jump or double jump, which will allow you to have more horizontal movement, which will allow you to have more options to infiltrate a base, with you being able to jump past gates, jump on various structures that will allow you to outmaneuver or sneak past your enemies more effectively, jump on rooftops of two-story buildings, or letting you have an escape option via jumping away to a higher elevation if you find yourself cornered. So you can hopefully see what I mean now by how the arm and leg cybernetics add a lot of options to how you can approach combat. But let's now get to what is perhaps the game changer of cybernetics in this game, aka the operating systems. Now, the operating system cybernetics consists of three types of incredibly powerful cybernetics that you can equip that will allow you to use various powerful abilities in the game. They're so powerful in fact that they can pretty much be the key item to making your build bonkers, with you having one OS, the cyber deck, allowing you to be able to hack your enemies so you can know their location, as well as debilitate them and even outright kill them if you got the right cyber deck and quick hacks, as well as being able to hack electronics. Then you got another OS, the Savanistan, which abilities allow you to be like the Flash, where you slow down everything around you, with you moving normally, which allows you to have a window where you can just get free hits, which can be massive since higher tier Savanistan can increase the damage you do as well. Then you got the Berserk OS, which allows you to be in a state where you are stronger. Now I don't have much experience with this OS since I haven't played with it. I did 2 playthroughs of the game, running a hacking / gunslinger character and a melee character katana using the Savanistan, so no comment on the third OS, but the Cybertech and Savanistan are, from my experience, incredibly powerful tools to have in the game, especially if you build them up right, with them opening up your options in battle considerably, as well as allowing you to absolutely dominate your enemies if you use them right. I also really like how distinct each operating system is, with each type having their own strengths that you can take advantage of, which really makes a playthrough feel very different depending on the OS you are using. So I would say that the overall cybernetic system does a pretty decent job of giving you options to expand what you can do in your combat scenarios, which is really cool and satisfying. Now I do wish all of the cybernetic slots were like that, rather than just some, but I'm still fine with what we have more or less. And to give credit to the cybernetic system, even the cybernetic system that doesn't increase your options, at least make your build be stronger via stronger numbers or niche passives, which still makes upgrading your cybernetics to feel satisfying still. It's just a shame that not more was done with the cybernetic system, at least in its current rendition at this date. But I think I made my point on why I like the cybernetic system and how it adds to the enjoyment factor of the game, in terms of it allowing you to have more options in the game through direct body upgrades. Well, now that we're done talking about cybernetics, let's move onward to the guns and overall weaponry. Admittedly, this is probably the area of the discussion where my gaming knowledge may fall a bit short since I haven't played much FPS. In fact, I haven't played an FPS to completion in like a decade, so I might be a tad lenient in this regard. But to me, I think the guns feel pretty fun to shoot. Each type of gun that is in the game feels like what their weapon type should be, with it having appropriate rate of fire, kickback, clip size, and force of impact, with your shotguns and revolvers being these satisfying guns to shoot with their high impact shots and recoil, while your assault rifles, high clip count, decent rate of fire, lower recoil, and good range makes them good guns to shoot at the medium range. I don't know, I just think the guns feel good to shoot in this game. But more importantly, I think the game does a great job of providing a good variety of guns for you to use. Now, like I talked about before, Cyberpunk 2077 does got the type of guns you expect to find in an open world city-based FPS like this, with it having pistols, shotguns, rifles, sniper rifles, and machine guns, alongside an assortment of melee weapons like katanas and baseball bats. But along with those weapon types, you also have various subtypes nestled within those weapon types that make each weapon type to have some variety in their respective weapon pool. Now the game does have the usual subtypes that you expect, such as having a combat shotgun or a sawed-off shotgun, or having a handgun or a revolver, and they function as differently as you expect, but the game also has some neat futuristic weapon subtypes that are cool to use, such as using a smart weapon where the weapon will auto-aim for you, and you just point and shoot and see that bullet curve towards the enemies for you. Or using a tech weapon where you're able to charge the shots for more penetrating power. Then you got grenades where you're able to detect nearby enemies or one that fires lasers, and then there's the sniper rifles where you're able to shoot through all type of cover from deadly force from afar. So I would say that overall the game does a pretty good job of providing the player with a variety of guns to tailor to a specific player playstyle, which is good as it provides the player with meaningful choices and variety in a playthrough. Now, are there disappointing factors with weapon system in the game? Yeah. Firstly, I think the distinction between the different melee weapons is pretty minimal. I mean, you got your katanas, hammers, clubs, machetes, and axes, and they look pretty cool, don't get me wrong, but I would be lying if I said that I found each of these melee weapons to be wholly different from each other gameplay wise. You just go unga bunga with them, and you go unga bunga with them in the same way. There's not like any different type of moves you take into account. You just go ham and spam the attack button. I would say the only meaningful variety to be found in the melee weapon pool is the knife, and then the rest in the melee weapons. And that's because you can throw the knife if you unlock a skill, which is cool because it's an additional option to be had when using melee weapons. But that's the only other distinction you have within the melee weapon pool. Now, this doesn't bother me too much because I do think that melee weapons at least feel pretty satisfying to use, so I'm not bored when I'm using them. It's actually pretty fun to slice up enemies using your katana. Granted, the melee weapon animation when used by the enemy feels pretty janky, which does introduce a few problems in terms of judging distance if you go mono to them, but I will say that the swinging animation of using a melee weapon in first person does still feel satisfying, at least when you're using it. Especially with how you're able to see them react to your swings via staggering them, and how you're even able to slice out various limbs depending on where you strike them when you go for the kill. So the actual usage of the melee weapons is still cool. I just wish there were more meaningful variants between melee weapons that make each melee weapon type to feel distinctive, like if blunt weapons did not do as much damage as bladed weapons, but you can actually knock an enemy down due to a blunt weapon's weight, or you could dual wield certain one-handed bladed weapons. I think it would be cool if there was some variety like that, but as it is, there's really not much variety to be found in the melee weapons in regards to how they're used in combat, besides the knife. Now, the second disappointment I had with the weapon system is the weapon attachments. The amount of attachments that can actually change up your weapon is pretty minimal and pretty abysmal if I'm being honest. The only customization you can add to your weapons through the weapon attachments is adding a scope, a silencer, and mods, which are only stat increases. Yeah, that's the entire spectrum of customization you get from the attachments from start to finish, which is incredibly disappointing, since that's not a lot to begin with, and a good amount of those attachments are even useless for some guns if you're going for a particular build. So it feels like the weapon attachment system either feels half-baked or unfinished, even in the game's current rendition. But yeah, those are the two main big problems I have with the weapon system in the game. But overall, I would say that I still enjoy the weapons in Cyberpunk 2077. Granted, the amount of customizations you can add to the weapon is minimal, but I still think the weapon variety is still good in Cyberpunk 2077 in regards to the actual guns in the game, with each different type of gun and their subtype still feeling pretty distinctive from each other and catering to a variety of playstyles. Finally, let's talk about the RPG progression systems. Cyberpunk 2077 being an open world action-adventure RPG, there are, of course, RPG mechanics in the form of a leveling system and skill tree, as well as stat allocation to what the game considers your main stats. The leveling system is as you expected, with you gaining experience from either combat or doing quests. When you get enough, you level up, with you gaining skill points and stat points which you can upgrade V with. Stat point allocation in the skill tree is also what they sound like, with you spending your stat and skill points into various upgrades. Well, to be more specific, you spend your stat points to gain general stat increases, as well as being able to unlock various skills that are locked behind a specific amount of main stat requirements. Well, you unlock the opportunity to be able to purchase them. You actually need skill points to actually learn them in the skill tree. And then you get the skill tree itself. As you probably guessed, skill tree upgrades are essentially fine-tuned upgrades you can get that pertains to strengthening a specific way you approach combat, or making you more effective in using a specific type of weapon. So that's the RPG system in a nutshell, and I think it works well. I mean, it's pretty much the typical RPG system you expect in a game like this, one that revolves around building a singular character and on encouraging you to do a specific build. But to the game's credit, I do think there is a lot of interesting skill trees in the game, as well as interesting branching paths within those skill trees. At least enough to at least make the building up your build part to be interesting and varied. Like you got a skill tree revolving around hacking, one around sneaking, one around quick hacks, one that gets you to be better with brawling, another that revolves around improving your pistol and rifle weapon proficiency, and so on, so I would say there is good build variety in the game. Granted, the skill tree does follow the same pattern of upgrades as the cybernetic system does, in that a good amount of the upgrades you are getting are more stat upgrades for playing a certain way or using a weapon type than actual new abilities, and that can be a tad disappointing. But I do think that the skill tree and overall RPG system does a pretty good job of rewarding a variety of playstyles from the upgrades, and I think it especially does a fantastic job in the strength progression you get from leveling up and making a decent build. Like, you just turn into a whirlwind of death if you're able to build your character correctly in this game, which does feel incredibly satisfying. Admittedly, it does make the late game difficulty to be a tad easy, since enemies aren't really designed to counter your late game abilities, since they were designed to be as generalized as possible as to accommodate the multiple builds that this game has. But I would say that this doesn't bother me too much, since I think one of the main appeals in the combat in this game is the varied playstyle and the feeling of power you get from decimating your enemies from building your character right. This game isn't really about challenging encounters, so the low late game difficulty doesn't really bother me too much. And if you're wondering, I played the game through hard and very hard difficulty in my 2 playthroughs. Now, is there something I take issue with in the leveling system? Probably the respec option. Like, I think it's cool that you're able to respec your skill tree points, but not being able to respec your attribute points does seem iffy, especially since your attribute points does determine what you can actually unlock in the skill tree, so the respec option doesn't really feel like a true respec in the game. Granted, each main point attribute covers a variety of skill trees, so you do have varied options to respec to, which does give respec a purpose, but it does feel disappointing that you can't completely change your build in this game. But besides that, I don't have any other issue with RPG systems in the game, and overall I would say that I really like the combat in this game. The strength of the combat really does come from the varied ways that you can play the game, as well as the satisfying power progression, which really make this game a lot of fun to play through, at least in regards to the overall combat system. Finally, we get to talk about what was perhaps one of the most anticipated features of the game, that is to say, the World of Cyberpunk 2077, or Night City. Now, this final aspect is probably the most mixed aspect of the game for me. There are various things I really like in the world design of Night City, but there are also aspects to its world design that heavily detract from the experience. I guess I should talk about the aspects that I liked about it. Firstly, I like the look and feel of Night City. I mean, I shouldn't even need to mention this, but the game is just graphically beautiful. There's a reason why people made a big deal about the way the game looked. It's just an overall impressive game graphically. And beyond that, I think the game really nails the atmosphere and overall artistic look of what a cyberpunk city would look like in a modern 3D video game. From the neon lights, the high-rise towers, the streets that is filled with highly commercialized ads that are used to sell your products that rip you off, the contrast between the fairly clean and slick district of the Corporate Plaza to the crime-filled rundown districts of Pacifica and Haywood. Every aspect of this world just screams cyberpunk. If there is one aspect that the game excels in, it's this. The second aspect I like in the world design is that I really like how distinct each district is in this game. They each have their own look and feel to them, which is great. It makes exploring in this game feel exciting due to how there is something new to discover when you're driving through the streets of Night City. Thirdly, I think the game got a good amount of side content in the world. From side stories to side gigs, there's a good amount of stuff to do, and I think a lot of them are pretty fun. The only one that's a bit iffy is the police scanner missions. They're a bit boring, but that's kind of expected, since they're the only type of side content that's repeatable. But the rest of the side content, I think they're generally interesting. I think the blue side gig missions is probably the more interesting side missions in the game, at least gameplay wise. since they get you to basically enter what is essentially the game's version of a dungeon, which gets you to engage the combat in interesting ways, since the layout to these places are usually multifaceted enough that you can tackle through these places in a variety of ways, depending on the build you got, as well as the cybernetic enhancements you got equipped. Not to mention that the enemy density in these blue psychic missions are usually more concentrated compared to the police scanner missions, and even some of the side story missions, which does add to the enjoyment. So overall, I would say that the blue psychic missions are probably the most fun side content that the game got to offer combat wise, and there's a good amount of them littered throughout Night City, which is great. Then we get to the side stories, which are also pretty fun. They are more story driven compared to the blue psychic missions, and while a good amount of them doesn't offer the same type of in-depth combat experiences as the blue psychics, I still do like how these type of missions are more varied in the sense that you don't just simply do combat in them. You got one where you have to go into a brain dance and piece together clues to solve a mystery, another where you're tailing someone's wife to see if she's having an affair, another where you're in a race, and so on. So the side stories are really fun to do for the story and for a change of pace if you've been doing the combat missions for a while. You just never know what to expect when you're doing one of the side stories, which is good, as it keeps things interesting when you're just tackling the side content. So those parts of the world design and Cyberpunk are the aspects I like the best, but there are some setbacks. The first is the driving. Oh man, dude, the vehicle in this game feels slippery as all heck. Apparently the driving is better now compared to before, but I just feel like I'm driving through ice if I just turn a little with the handbrake. But if I don't use the handbrake at all, I barely turn. So yeah, the turning in this game while driving feels really off. I would say driving a motorcycle feels a bit better, but not because the control is better, but simply because you have more space to control your turn due to the motorcycle itself being smaller than your usual cars and trucks. I also say that the acceleration is a bit bonkers, at least on keyboard and mouse, since pressing on the W button accelerates you to the max speed, and you can't really control the acceleration. You just have to constantly let go of the gas pedal and step on it again to sort of brute force your way to adjusting your acceleration, which does feel annoying. Now this might be a problem pertaining only to keyboard and mouse, so this might be a personal issue, but it's still annoying. And lastly, probably my biggest issue with driving, the minimap. The minimap while you're driving barely shows you more than a block around you, which can be an issue when you're driving to your destination and the route requires you to do a sharp turn. Please, CD Projekt Red, just expand that minimap. So as you can see, driving overall doesn't feel the best in this game, to say the least. Now, can you get used to these issues? Yeah, I certainly got used to them, but that didn't mean that I particularly liked driving in the game. Heck, I found it annoying at times, which can be an issue when driving is your main mode or traversal in this game. Like the only vehicle that I think driving is fine is, yeah, like I said before, the motorcycle, because again, of its compact size. The rest, they can be a bit frustrating at times. While for a good amount of the vehicles, there are a few cars that I think drive pretty okay, but the majority of them feel so slippery to control, with the minimap issue not really helping the situation too. So that's the first issue I have with the world design of Cyberpunk 2077. The next and final issue is that the world of Cyberpunk 2077 isn't really all that interactable. Now this is a problem that doesn't bother me too much since I'm fine with treating Night City as more of a set piece than an actual breathing city where things happen regardless if you're there or not. But I can see how the lack of interactivity can bum people out, especially after watching the marketing of the game. Heck, even on its own, Night City is probably one of the least interactive cities I've experienced in a video game in recent memory. What with how the game doesn't even have a proper police system or chase system, how NPCs just wander around with no rhyme and purpose and don't even have that much interesting to say if you do go and say hi to them, how enemies are statically bound to specific locations on the map with you really having no chance of running into them on the road, how specific gangs in the city stay static from the start of the game to the end of the game, how there's really not any other side minigame to partake in the city besides the horse arcade game they added in. And I think you get the point. Night City is not really all that interactive of a city when you get down to it, which is a bit disappointing. Now, like I said before, I don't mind this too much. I'm okay with treating Night City as a set piece and having the focus of the game be on doing these quest lines that get you to experience the various interesting stories and interesting combat scenarios that the game has to offer. I think those aspects of the game are the best parts of Cyberpunk 2077. But I do have to admit that it still feels pretty jarring how uninteractive the city is when you're playing through the game, especially the police system issue. It's really weird how the game, at this date at least, still don't have a functioning police system. A game where, mind you, that the only meaningful interaction they can do to various NPCs is to commit crimes. So yeah, that does feel incredibly odd. Now I have heard that they're revamping the police system, so this issue might solve itself in the future. But still, even without the police issue, I still think it was a missed opportunity that Night City was not more interactive. I mean, Night City is so integral to the story and characters of Cyberpunk that the city might as well be a character in itself, and I think it would have been really cool if Night City felt like a living city in the actual gameplay, with you being able to interact with the many outlets of vice and entertainment you see on display in the streets of Night City, as well as feel how cutthroat the city is if you wander into the wrong district in town and get mugged or attacked on those various streets. It would have been cool to see a reputation system of sorts and see how your actions could positively or negatively affect the various criminal organizations that exist within Night City. I just think it's disappointing that Night City is as uninteractive as it is, given its importance to the overall world of Cyberpunk. Before I wrap all this up, let's talk about some problems I have with the game. Okay, I already talked about quite a few problems that Cyberpunk 2077 already has, but that was in conjunction with what the game does well, and why those good points are hampered by something. That, or I at least explain why those aspects are pretty mixed. These points that I'm going to talk about are just straight up flaws to the game, at least in my eyes. The first problem is the controls or keybinds for rolling in Cyberpunk 2077 on the keyboard and mouse. So you know what the keybind for rolling is in this game? It's by double tapping either of the movement keys on the keyboard, aka the WASD buttons. Why are the keybind like this for rolling, CD Projekt Red? Just why? This keybind makes strafing such a pain in the game, since you can accidentally do a roll by accident when you're carefully strafing around, which can get you killed in the game. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten killed due to accidentally rolling when I was trying to side strafe carefully around enemies. Apparently you can change this by messing with the game files, but the fact you have to do this and how there's still not an option to change this keybind in the in-game options still makes this issue a failure in my opinion. The next problem? Brain dances. Now, firstly, I think they are a neat idea, what with how you're essentially exploring and gathering clues in what is basically someone's memory of an event in a 3D space. But the problem is that they feel so handholdy, to the point where they just feel like a glorified point and click section without the added puzzle solving or mystery solving that is usually associated with dedicated point and click games, since this game just straight out tells you all the significance of a clue without you having to do any thinking on how the clue might correlate to the case in hand, or why it's there to begin with. The fact that it's also extremely easy to know how many clues are in a given area by just looking at the Braindance UI also adds quite a lot to the hand-holding nature of the brain dances. As a result, brain dances can feel like a very drawn out and unskippable cutscene that feels extremely boring to play through. It also doesn't help that the control for the brain dances are not the most intuitive thing out there. Thirdly, the healing system. The healing system in Cyberpunk 2077 is way too lenient in my opinion. I mean, I know I say one of the main appeals of the game is more about overpowering your enemies with your nifty builds than it is about providing challenging encounter design, but making healing as abundant and having no limitations like it is in Cyberpunk 2077 might be taking it a bit too far. I mean, you can pretty much hold as many healing items as you can in the game, and there's like no cooldown after using one. So you can probably see why it can take a lot of the difficulty out of the game. Heck, I sometimes don't use the healing item sometimes due to how OP it feels at times, and just try to stick to the health implant since that has a cooldown to it. The only time where I think healing didn't feel too overpowered was probably in the Don't Fear the Reaper ending route, though that might have to do with how you can almost get one shot in that ending route due to how your max health is slowly reduced over time during the ending. Personally, I think adding a cooldown to your health items would probably help in the balancing department, but that's just me. Lastly, let's talk about the glitches. Now don't get me wrong, this game is much more stable now. I haven't had any game crashes in all the time that I played through it, and I did 2 playthroughs of Cyberpunk 2077. But that doesn't mean that this game is glitch free. Far from it. The game is still filled with quite a decent amount of glitches and bugs. Most of them are just visual glitches, which isn't too bad and can be ignored most of the time. Like I had a glitch where the entire world would glow if I went into the menu. So yeah, glitches like that. Other glitches can be a bit annoying, like falling out of the map annoying, or getting a blinding glare if you drive the car in the first person perspective annoying. But okay, still not too bad, though still pretty darn annoying if you do run into it. The one glitch that got on my nerves though is the glitch where your Suffice won't activate. Apparently this happens because of ability overlap. Well, specifically overlapping activatable abilities that have a timer built into them, like using the Korinsakov and Suffice together. But man, if that's the case, that seems like a pretty big oversight, given that this game is an RPG, a genre where you expect to not only level up and learn cool abilities, but also combine certain abilities together. I'm still surprised that this hasn't been patched yet, given how big of a mechanic the Suffice is. I mean, it's one of the main OSs you can use in the game, and is one of those game changer mechanics in Cyberpunk 2077. Hell, you'll probably see more people using it now due to their Edge Runner anime. But I digress. The glitch exists and man, is extremely frustrating when it happens in the middle of a combat situation. Granted, you can reload and the glitch will disappear, like most glitches in the game, but given that you can't save during battle, it probably means you'll be undoing quite a bit of progress, especially if autosave didn't kick in for a while, which again can be incredibly frustrating. And even outside of battle, having to reload your game again due to a glitch is still not ideal. We have now gone through what are pretty much my thoughts and feelings on Cyberpunk 2077, at least at this date. Overall, I would say that Cyberpunk 2077 is a good game now at this current iteration, with the strength of the game definitely coming in from the story and writing, the setting, and the combat, particularly in how it accommodates a variety of builds and provide a good amount of options in battle, as well as the progression feeling satisfying. The highs of this game is very prominent, I think, and it should be heavily applauded that the game has been patched to such an extent that it's now as good as it is. But having said that, even with the improvements, you can still see how the game's troubled development cycle still haunt this game to this day, with the game still having various issues holding it back, with the implementation of life paths and some of the world design being prime examples of that. And when you even try to compare even this version of the game to the version that CD Projekt Red marketed to us, well, let's just say that reality still falls quite short of the dream. Okay, that sounds a bit harsh, but I just want to temper expectations a bit so you guys don't go into this game thinking that Cyberpunk 2077 is now the game that was advertised in the marketing, and that all the issues that plagued the game at launch is now gone. That's not the reality, at least at this current version of the game. But if you judge the game on its own merits, I would say that Cyberpunk 2077 is now a really fun game, and is a game that I would play again. It may not be the revolutionary game that it was promised to be, but I would say that in its current iteration, Cyberpunk 2077 is a game that's worth playing.